Four different programs in Texas are teaming up for a charity exhibition doubleheader to help with ongoing disaster relief efforts in Maui. And we say, keep them coming.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Friday. Welcome in to the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part, of course, of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, and today we are continuing our conference preview series to close out the week. We're going to be talking about the MEAC conference today, Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference, discussing if Howard, who added a pair of Power 5 transfers, can they use those guys to help win the league yet again? We'll get into all of that, award predictions, biggest storylines, coaching changes, etc. But first, want to lead off today's show talking about another charity exhibition event that has been scheduled. This is going to be a 4-team event, 2 separate exhibition games, a doubleheader between 4 schools in Texas. You got Texas A&M versus Texas Tech is kind of the headlining event of the day. And then you have the leadoff game is between North Texas and Sam Houston State. These games are going to take place on October 29th in Denton, Texas, home of North Texas. The games are taking place, as so many exhibition games have been scheduled this year, as an effort to raise money for Maui relief. Of course, we've talked about it a handful of times on the podcast. There is disaster relief efforts ongoing in the Lahaina area. The Maui Invitational has been moved to Honolulu instead of at the Lahaina Civic Center as it typically is played. And we have seen a handful of teams kind of step up to have their charity or their exhibition games be for charity, to have this money be raised in an effort to help with relief efforts. Now we have this 4-team, 2-game doubleheader taking place in Texas. It'll be part of what they're calling the Compete for Cause Classic, taking place again in Denton, Texas. And look, these are quality matchups. These are really fun exhibition games. A&M versus Texas Tech should be a really fun game. A&M is a top 15, top 20 team. For those of you who listen to Thursday's episode of Locked On College Basketball, you know that our guy Leaf Tulane has A&M just inside the top 10. Texas Tech is, of course, as a program kind of undergoing significant changes after first the Chris Beard leaving and then Mark Adams not lasting particularly long at Texas Tech. So it's a program that's in a little bit of a kind of a transitional period, but should still be a fun matchup. North Texas is a team that went to the NIT championship game last year, and they're going to face off against Sam Houston State, who's kind of replacing them in Conference USA, as North Texas, of course, is part of that exodus from Conference USA going over to the American Conference. But really, the matchups aren't the most interesting thing here. There are a lot of good exhibition matchups. In fact, there are a lot of good exhibition matchups that are specifically being done in part to help with relief efforts. You have Kansas and Illinois. They're going to play each other. You have Michigan State and Tennessee going to face off against each other. Of course, both Kansas and Tennessee are a part of the Maui Invitational Tournament. You also have St. Mary's playing Hawaii. Of course, Hawaii has a vested interest in helping with those relief efforts, but that is another exhibition game that's going to take place. And really, the big story here is that we should have more of these, because there isn't just charity needed when there is a natural disaster. Every year, teams could have exhibition games. They could publicize them. They could put them on TV. They could allow fans to come to the games, even if they didn't want them on TV. Just have fans in attendance and have that money be raised towards charity. There is no real compelling reason to not continue to do this. I'm not trying to shame teams who are not doing this, who are not going to do this in the future. I think it's fantastic that these games are happening now, but it signals that we can continue to do this. In the past, most exhibition games have been done in these kind of secret scrimmage style where you don't even know who the team played. You don't know what the score was. And I understand why coaches want to do that. It's not a secret. It's not a surprise why coaches, in particular high-level coaches who have intention of going to the Elite Eight, Final Four, National Championship, don't want to give away their cards too early in the season. Maybe you're still trying to figure stuff out. Trying to decide, is this the guy we want first off the bench? Is this the guy we want starting? Is this the offense we want to run? Is this a play that we want to give a shot to? And you're trying to figure that stuff out before the actual games start, before the season begins. And I can understand not necessarily wanting that televised. It makes sense. But college basketball is about more than that. And I think for me, more games, more exposure, more opportunities to see coaching staffs maybe experimenting. I would love to see some of these teams, be willing to play these exhibition games in ways where fans can watch them, fans can buy tickets, go to the game. That money is raised for charity, and you get a chance to see, Bill Self experimenting with some different lineups, or Mark Few trying something different in their tennis in their exhibition game like they had against Tennessee last year, kind of trying some new things, experimenting in certain ways. I get why these coaches have liked having these secret scrimmages where they can kind of mess around and acknowledge that, hey, we're trying something new, you try something new, let's just kind of give it a go and see how it goes, and we'll kind of go back in the lab and reassess afterwards. I get it. I understand the appeal of that. Don't get me wrong. But the fact that these teams have been willing to make these public events at these public exhibition games in order to raise money for something very important like the relief efforts in Maui and in Lahaina, we can do this every year. We can raise money every year for different charities, whether we want to raise it for Coaches versus Cancer, which I know is a charity that many college coaches are involved in, whether we want to raise it for, whatever institution, organization, philanthropic endeavor we want. I think more public exhibition games with more eyes on them, it gets people more excited about the college basketball season, which at the end of the day, many of these coaches, that's the thing they care about more than anything else. They want to grow the game. They want college basketball to be more accessible to fans, to students, to alumni, to whomever. Publicizing your exhibition games, making them public, making them viewable, that is a way to do it. And doing it for charity is a cherry on top. Not only does it make you look good, it helps with PR, it also raises money for a good cause. At the end of the day, even if you're doing it for posturing reasons, for PR reasons, whatever, you're helping people. And getting the opportunity to do that while raising raising money, while also raising the kind of viewership of college athletics, of college basketball, making the game grow, seems like a win-win to me. So I'm hoping that this is the start of something that we will continue to see going forward, where teams will be more willing to play their exhibition games publicly and help use that money that they make from those games to raise money for various charities. Well, folks, next up is our latest conference preview as we continue to get through these heading into the college basketball season. Today, we're going to discuss coaching changes and other storylines in the MEAC conference. But before we get to that, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Nutrafol. You don't have to choose between better hair growth and your health. Nutrafol provides a whole body health approach for men that promotes healthier hair. No drugs, no compromises, just better hair. Nutrafol is the #1 dermatologist recommended hair growth supplement, clinically shown to improve your hair growth, visible thickness, and visible scalp coverage. And it works. In a clinical study, 84% of men showed improvement in their hair after 6 months taking Nutrafol's men's hair growth supplements. Take the first step to visibly thicker, healthier hair. For a limited time, Nutrafol is offering our listeners $10 off your first month subscription and free shipping when you go to Nutrafol.com/men and enter the promo code LOCKEDONCollege. Find out why over 4,000 healthcare professionals recommend Nutrafol for healthier hair. That's Nutrafol.com/men, spelled Nutrafol.com/men. Enter the promo code LOCKEDONCollege. Folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners checking out the show on YouTube. We are getting into our conference preview series of the day here, closing out the week on Friday, talking about the MEAC Conference, Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference, starting with the biggest storyline. And for the MEAC, heading into the 23-24 season, the biggest storyline is a coaching change going on at Coppin State. Coppin State was one of the worst teams in the conference last year, typically bad teams in bad conferences replacing their coaches. Not exactly a storyline that would make huge headlines, but there's a bit of a twist to this coaching change for Coppin State. Because the coach who is being replaced is none other than former Maryland star and longtime NBA player Juan Dixon. Juan Dixon has been fired by the Coppin State Eagles after 6 seasons as the head coach. And there is more to the story than just getting fired for poor performance. But let's start there, because it was a pretty poor performance. Coppin State was not good. They did not show improvement during Dixon's tenure as the head coach. They went 51 and 131 in those 6 seasons. That is a 28% winning record. They went 9 and 23 last year, which is, you guessed it, a 28% winning record. No real improvement shown over the duration of Juan Dixon's tenure. Any coach who spends 6 years coaching at a school and doesn't win more than 30% of their games is probably going to get canned. And that is a prominent part of Juan Dixon's firing. But there is a bit more to it. Dixon is part of a lawsuit that is going on against Coppin State because of actions of one of his assistant coaches. Lucien Brownlee is being accused of sexually assaulting and blackmailing a former player on the Coppin State roster. It sounds like he managed to get this player to send him pictures and has been using those to blackmail the player. It is a messy situation. There's a lawsuit going on. Again, Dixon is named in the lawsuit because of his position as the head coach. I don't think there's necessarily a lot of indication that Dixon knew what was happening or had any kind of super role other than negligence, which is what, you get included in that conversation because of that. But when you have a coaching staff that has a bad egg, like somebody like Brownlee on it, as an institution, you're facing legal ramifications because people who were put in charge were obviously exploiting those positions. And you have a team that hasn't won more than 30% of their games. Pretty easy to make the decision to clean house, move on from the coaching staff there. Again, Dixon, national champion with Maryland about 20 years ago, longtime NBA player, also been on reality television for the last half decade or so. He's on the Real Housewives of Potomac. He's been on that show for 7 years with his wife. So sad to see Dixon go. A player personally I watched a lot when he was in college, and I watched him a lot in the NBA with the Portland Trailblazers, my home team. So I'm very familiar with Juan Dixon. Sad to see this be the situation and how it goes. I'm certain when he took the job, he wanted to win more than 30% of his games and did not want to be in a situation where a lawsuit was levied against him. Hopefully things work out okay for him and, of course, for the player who is involved in the lawsuit. But right now for Coppin State, the Eagles turn their attention to Larry Stewart, who they are hiring to replace Juan Dixon. Larry Stewart is an icon at Coppin State. 2-time MEAC Player of the Year. He scored 20 points per game across 3 seasons with Coppin State in the late 80s, early 90s. He played in the NBA for a significant amount of time, a 6-year NBA career. And in fact, he was the first undrafted free agent to make an all-rookie team. First ever to do that. Not surprising that somebody who was a prolific scorer did not get drafted out of Coppin State, even in the 90s. You're not surprised to hear that, but the guy went on to average 10 and 6 as a rookie. All-rookie second teamer, spent about a half decade in the NBA, played professionally all the way until 2008, including a long tenure overseas. Since then, he has been an assistant coach at Bowie State from 2009 to 2015. He was an assistant at Morgan State, also in the MEAC from 2015 to 2019. And he was an assistant coach at Maryland Eastern Shore, also in the MEAC conference from 2019 to 2023, including a brief tenure as their associate head coach. So this is a guy who is an icon from Coppin State. He is a longtime professional basketball player with connections overseas. And he's spent most of the last decade coaching in the MEAC conference. Pretty easy to see why this would be a slam dunk hire for Coppin State. Hopefully Stewart can get this program turned around and out of the cellar in the MEAC conference. Looking forward to other storylines in the conference. As we've kind of talked about a lot with these mid-major, low-major conferences, unfortunately, one of the storylines that we kind of have to keep coming back to tends to be the fact that a lot of talent leaves the conference every year. In this situation, a ton of the key talent, a ton of the first teamers, second teamers, leading scorers graduated and they just ran out of eligibility. That's a pretty common storyline. But we also saw 1 first teamer and 3 second teamers from last year's conference all hit the transfer portal. That includes Elijah Hawkins, who was a first teamer last year. He transfers from Howard to Minnesota in the Big Ten. Then you have second teamer Nenda Tarkey, who transferred from Coppin State to Nichols State. Second teamer Steve Settle transferred from Howard to Temple. And then second teamer Justin Wright transferred from NC Central to LMU. I think we discussed him briefly on that WCC preview earlier this week. You also had Kevon Voiles transfer from Maryland Eastern Shore to Marshall. He averaged 13-3 last year for Maryland Eastern Shore. So a lot of talent out the door, a lot of guys who graduated, a lot of guys who transferred away to different programs. But there is some intriguing transfers coming into the conference. We'll talk about a few of these guys a little bit more later in the show, but we have Seth Towns. Seth Towns comes from Ohio State to Howard. He was a guy who wasn't super productive at Ohio State, but was productive previously in his career at Harvard. You have Dom Campbell transferring from Notre Dame to Howard. Two guys joining Howard from the Power 5 level. You also have Damon Tate coming from Boston University to Norfolk State, another decent transfer coming over to the MEAC conference. We're going to close out the show discussing the favorites to win the MEAC this upcoming season, as well as a dark horse team who could potentially get into that conversation. We're also going to make some end of the season award predictions, talk about our tiers in the conference, all of that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. That's what brings home the winning trophy, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every single time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at all the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that victory. Keep your ride or die alive at ebay.com/motors. eBay's Guaranteed Fit only applies to U.S. customers and eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. All right, folks, closing out the show and the week here on Locked On College Basketball, talking about the MEAC Conference. Last year's winner was the Howard Bison, and we're going to start there. Are they the favorite to repeat? Because they went 11-3 last year in the regular season, but this is a team that lost three key starters. We talked about a pair of them already. Elijah Hawkins averaged 12.6 rebounds for this team last year. He was a first teamer in the MEAC Conference, and he transfers all the way up to Minnesota. You don't see guys go from the MEAC straight to the Power 5 level all of that often. Clearly a sign that Hawkins was one of the best players in the conference. Minnesota's taken a gamble on a guy coming from this level to be productive for them in the Big Ten, one of the most competitive conferences in all of college basketball. So no doubt that this is a tough loss for Howard. They also lose Steve Settle. Settle 11.6 rebounds last year. So that's, 23 points and 12 rebounds combined between those two guys. He goes over to Temple. You also lose Jordan Wood. Wood averaged 8.6 points and 3.7 assists last year. He transfers to Tulane. But teams like Howard, when you win the conference and you lose key pieces, you can find ways to replicate that. And they did so by adding a couple of very intriguing transfers. We touched on them a little bit previously in Dom Campbell and Seth Towns. Dom Campbell basically did not play at Notre Dame, kind of a wild card addition for Howard. It'll be interesting to see how he adjusts. Again, we've seen guys who play very little or not at all at Power 5 level programs who transfer down and end up succeeding. The obvious story that's thrown around a lot is Brandon Pajemski, who averaged less than a point per game, or I think almost exactly a point per game at Illinois, transfers to Santa Clara, ends up being a top 20 pick in the 2023 NBA draft. Is that going to happen with Dom Campbell and Howard? Probably not. It is an exceedingly rare story, but just because somebody wasn't productive or wasn't even really on the floor at a Power 5 level program does not necessarily mean that they aren't going to step in. In fact, if you look at the almanac and their rankings for the MEAC conference, they talk about Dom Campbell as being a potential starter for Howard. So this guy who could step in and play right away. And then you also have Seth Towns. Seth Towns, 3.8 points per game at Ohio State. Certainly a player that Buckeyes fans were hoping to see more of from him. He started his career at Harvard, averaged over 14 points per game at Harvard in 2 seasons. And then he missed 2 years. Significant injury issues have just completely derailed the promising basketball career of Seth Towns. Again, 14 points per game in the Ivy League, opportunity to go to a Big Ten school and contribute, just never really gets off the ground because of all those injury issues. Less than 4 points per game last year when he did play for the Buckeyes. Now getting an opportunity to close out his college basketball career at Howard, potentially make the NCAA tournament, a school that did it last year. This is kind of a good last dance opportunity for Towns, and I expect that he's going to step up and be a really big contributor and a key player, not just for Howard, but for the entire MEAC conference this upcoming season. Howard is not the only team expected to do well in the MEAC this year, and in fact, they are not the clear runaway favorite. Norfolk State, they only went 9-5 last year, but they went in league play, I should say. They did go 22-11 overall. So a team that was very successful last year, a 20-win campaign, but they lose 4 double-digit scorers. Joe Bryant averaged about 18 points per game last year. He's out the door. Chris Bankston was about 14 per game. Dana Tate, 10.3, and Kaheem Brown averaged 11. Pretty hard to consider yourself a team that might jump in the standings when you lose 4 double-digit scorers from your roster. But Norfolk State, again, similar to Howard, made some pretty productive additions in the transfer portal, including UNC Wilmington transfer Jamari Thomas. Thomas was a sophomore last year at UNC Wilmington. He averaged 7 points, 2.2 assists, 2.2 boards, shot about 34% from deep. There's a real expectation that he's going to have the ball in his hands a lot for Norfolk State. He's a line driver. He's a fantastic at finishing around the rim, a guy who thrives with the basketball a bunch. The expectation is that going from Wilmington to Norfolk State, where again, he's going to have the ball a lot, get those opportunities to attack the rim, a strong shooter from beyond the arc as well. I think there's a good expectation that Thomas is potentially going to be one of, if not the very best addition into the entire MEAC. And if he's the transfer of the year, the newcomer of the year, whatever, there's a real chance that Norfolk State can get pushed over the edge and significantly challenge Howard for a championship in that league. And he's not the only addition. He's not the only addition in the guard room. Jamari Thomas is going to be flanked on the outside by Alan Betrand. Betrand has been around the block. He spent 2 years at Towson, then transferred to Rhode Island, spent 1 year in the A-10, spent last year at Rider. Career 7.7 points per game, 2.4 rebounds per game, and a career 35% shooter from deep. As a sophomore in the 2020-21 season, or excuse me, the 2019-2020 season at Towson, that was his most productive season of his college career. He averaged 13.6 points. He shot just under 38% from deep. It's not unreasonable to expect that Betrand could step into that kind of role at Norfolk State. He's got a solid shooter, a solid distributor, a solid driver to the basket in Jamari Thomas, flanking him on the side as a outside shooter, a guy who's a catch and shoot guy. He could shoot 40+% from three. There's reason to believe that he could really thrive in that offense, especially if they can get those two guys to coalesce together. It's really, the opportunity is going to be there for those two guys to have the best seasons of their productive, up to this point, college careers, and it's going to make life really, really difficult for opposing backcourts in the MEAC conference. They also had a big man from Buffalo in Khalil Meding. Meding averaged 4.5 points and 2.2 boards last year for Buffalo. Caveat, of course, is that was in only 6 games, so it's a little hard to judge anything based off of a 6-game sample size, but still to get a 6'7" guy in who had at least some level of productivity at a school like Buffalo is certainly a promising side for Norfolk State. We got one dark horse team that I want to talk about here before we get into the tiers as well as our award predictions. Dark horse team is Morgan State. Morgan State was 7-7 last year in the MEAC. They finished 5th in the conference. They also lose 2 very productive scorers from their team in Malik Miller, 17.5 points per game, and Isaiah Burke, who was at 18.7 points per game. Very tough losses, but they add 2 key transfers in Winston Tabbs and Miles Thompson. Tabbs spent 2 years at Boston College in the ACC, 13.7 points, 3.4 boards, 2.3 assists, and 36% from deep. In those 2 years, missed a year after that, and then not nearly himself last year at East Carolina, only played 11 minutes per game, 3.5 points. So there's certainly reason to be a little bit concerned about whether the Winston Tabbs, who was a double digits per game scorer in the ACC, is going to be that version, in which case he could be the player of the year in the conference, or if he's going to be the guy who averaged barely 4 points not even 4 points per game at East Carolina. Big spread right there, but definitely worth taking a gamble on for Morgan State. They also add Miles Thompson. He was at St. Francis in the NEC for the last 4 years. He's a graduate transfer, 11.2 points, 3.5 boards, shot 41% from deep last season at St. Francis. He's 6'6". He's probably going to be an undersized 4, stretch 4, but anybody who can shoot 40+% from 3 is certainly somebody you want to have on your roster to help with that floor spacing. So watch out for Morgan State as a potential team that could challenge that kind of top tier of Howard and Norfolk State, which is what I want to get into right now. We separated this conference into 3 tiers. We only just recently started doing the tiers as part of our conference preview series. So if you missed a few of the previews, or if you heard the earlier ones, this is something we're kind of just bringing in right now, but want to get an opportunity to kind of label all of the schools in this conference by different tiers. Tier 1 is Howard and Norfolk State. Those are kind of above everybody else right now. Tier 2, you have North Carolina Central, you have Morgan State, again, our dark horse pick here, and then you also have Maryland Eastern Shore. You round it out in Tier 3 with Coppin State with their new head coach, Larry Stewart, as well as Delaware State and South Carolina State, 2 programs that struggled significantly last season. Closing out the show with our award predictions, starting with Player of the Year. We're going with Shai Odom. Shai Odom was the freshman of the year last year at Howard, entering his sophomore season with the Bison. 11 points per game, 4.6 boards, 1.4 assists. Again, he did all of that as a true freshman last year. He's a 6'6" forward. Expectation is that he's going to step into a much bigger role for Howard as they lost 3 key starters, flanked by some new transfers coming in. I think there's a real opportunity for Odom to be the guy in the MEAC and potentially put up the numbers worthy of being the Player of the Year. Transfer/newcomer of the year. We talked about a handful of different guys who could potentially win this award, including Jamari Williams coming over to Norfolk State. But the guy that I really want to talk about is Winston Tabbs. We just talked about him a little bit earlier, the guy who's transferring, who spent 2 years at Boston College. Again, it's hard for me to ignore somebody who averaged nearly 14 points per game across 2 seasons at Boston College. Yes, Boston College has not historically been good. And yes, the talent on the roster when Tabbs was there is not, equivalent to the talent of Duke or Virginia, North Carolina, or any other schools in the ACC. But being able to put up 14 points per game in the ACC means you can ball. It means you are good. And injuries have just wrecked him for the last couple of years. Again, he did virtually nothing at East Carolina last year, but the talent is there. And I'm willing to gamble that a player with that level of talent, if he is healthy for his final year of eligibility, could step up at Morgan State, lead that team in scoring, maybe even lead the conference in scoring, and be the kind of guy who's not only the transfer of the year, he's on the first team, and again, he's legitimately challenging for Player of the Year in the MEAC conference. Coach of the Year going with Kevin Brodius at Morgan State. Again, if we believe that somebody like Winston Tabbs is going to take that step, if we believe that Miles Thompson, the newcomer from St. Francis, who averaged 11 points and shot 41% from 3, if those 2 guys can come in, Morgan State has a real chance to legitimately win the entire conference, if not at least finish second and challenging Howard and Norfolk State at the very top. I think this is the year that Morgan State does it, and I think Kevin Brodius takes home that Coach of the Year trophy. Final award here, Defensive Player of the Year, Martaz Robinson at Delaware State, trying to get somebody in from a team we haven't talked much about. Robinson averaged 1.5 steals in 30 minutes per game last year as a junior. He's a 6'3" guard with good hands. He should have plenty of playing time, plenty of opportunity to lead the conference in steals or be at the top, which could be enough for him to take home that Defensive Player of the Year trophy. It's going to wrap us up here today on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Thanks again for listening. Enjoy your weekend, folks. We'll be back next week with more conference previews, more college basketball coverage. Schedules are coming out. Schedules are getting finalized around the league. So we got so much fun stuff to talk about as we get into October, the final month before the start of the college basketball regular season. Thank you so much for listening, as always. And until next time, peace out.